Oh, hello and welcome. I think we're live to. Ooh, it's lighter today than usual by my standards, or the standards of my old machine. But anyway, hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to talk about something that actually was a topic inspired by reading the liner notes of an album, and that is, does anyone just sing anymore? Well, the simple answer is yes. The human voice is the most portable of all instruments because whether you like it or not, it travels with you wherever you go. But there was something, like I said, very specific that made me think of this, and it's the liner notes to a 1985 album by the wonderful singer Vic Damone. It's an album called I Just Called to Say I Love You, named for, of course, the famous Stevie Wonder song. And the liner notes were written by none other than here's Johnny Carson himself. So let me just read you these liner notes if I can see them over here. So Johnny says, yeah, we're not going to do that. Listening to Victor Moan sing is like watching Fred Astaire dance. Like any great artist, Vic makes his craft look and sound effortless. No tricks, no self-serving musical gimmicks to confuse the listener. Just straight ahead, beautiful singing to tell the musical story. Um, Young would-be singers would do well to listen and realize that real art should appear simple and uncomplicated. Victor Moan knows this, and that is why his stature in the music world is assured. Now, obviously, you're not going to include liner notes on your own album of someone who doesn't like you, but I nevertheless find Johnny's words very illuminating because the point that he's getting at is that Victor Moan isn't stylized. He doesn't use any sound effects. He doesn't use any weird sort of studio trickery, which, has always existed, even though it gets a bit more complicated and a bit more capable, the trickery that is every year. He's just got his microphone, a little bit of echo on the EQ, and he goes for it. And he can do it on a plane, on a boat, on a train, and that's only somewhat facetious because he did in his final decades a lot of singing on cruise ships as well as in clubs and in theaters. Now, what does all of this mean? Because it's not just about Victor Moan. It's really about Victor Moan's entire generation and the one or two before his, where a singer was really expected to be nearly perfect for any occasion. And I think that I think objectively we can say we've gotten away from that. And I think that there's some very interesting reasons why. And in order to determine what those reasons are, we need to look at how the nature of where the singer sits in the wider musical ecosystem. We need to look at how that's changed. So let's look at the generation of singers that became what is in hindsight called traditional pop or classic pop music. You know the names. These are the singers who sung the Great American Songbook when it was comparatively new. People like Bing Crosby, people like Frank Sinatra, people like Perry Como, people like Dean Martin, people like Al Martino, people like Vic Damone, people like Johnny Hartman, etc. You all know most of these names, and those are just some of the ones who are the most famous. Now, what did these vocalists have in common? Well, let's look at what they didn't do. They didn't write songs. They didn't arrange songs. They typically didn't play an instrument, certainly not on stage. Many of them were musically literate and capable. In fact, I believe most were, but they didn't appear on stage at a piano or with a guitar or a harmonica or trumpet or anything else. They appeared with the microphone because their main attraction was their voice. They were also expected to be all purpose entertainers, though. So while they weren't expected to be great instrumentalists, they were expected to dance, they were expected to act, not necessarily at a Shakespearean level, but in a modern way, and they were expected to be able to tell a joke and do a bit of improvisational repartee with an audience. It was the age of the singer as the grand entertainer, and this, of course, has its roots even before the Great American Songbook in things like the vaudeville and music hall traditions that preceded the 1920s. and in many ways were still alive during the 1920s. And so there was these singers really had to rely on their voice for everything, and they often played in very poor environments. Many of them grew up before amplification was standard in your average club or even in your average theater, so they needed to understand dynamic control, diaphragm control, all of these things that are things that classical singers, opera singers, are trained very specifically to know. But even within the more intimate pop singing realm, they had to have some pseudo or partial, let's say, pardon me, classical vocal technique. Because they were used to playing in, okay, this is a dingy club, a big theater, they needed to be able to sing near perfectly in any situation. They weren't necessarily given the luxury of sound checks. Many of them were even born before the concept of the sound check was invented. And this really made them very adaptable. They could be sitting on a sofa with Johnny Carson 1 minute, drinking some whiskey, smoking some cigarettes, and 5 minutes later, they'd be expected to pick up the microphone and sing a song live nearly perfectly. And many singers today, whether they're singers with a great reputation or a mediocre reputation, look at that and think, oh God, I can't sing unless I do my vocal exercises and have a steam treatment and I don't speak to anyone for 2 hours to preserve my voice. Not that generation. They were expected to sing songs that were sometimes relatively complicated vocally, and they were expected to do it after shooting the breeze with a drink and a cigarette. And that's just how it was. Very, very adaptable. Now, the fact that they were singing songs that were written by others, these songs from the Great American Songbook, composed by a combination of Broadway composers, jazz composers, and Tin Pan Alley songwriters, it meant that they were really using their unique voice and their unique interpretation, their vocal arrangement. Because while they didn't do the instrumental arrangements, they worked with great arrangers, people like Don Costa, people like Nelson Riddle, like Gordon Jenkins, later on like Jimmy Webb, who also was a songwriter and composer. They used their vocal arrangement, they used the timbre and the texture of their vocals, their enunciation. They used that to put their individual stamp on a song that people had already heard. Because when you're singing someone else's song, you're not really trying to present the audience with something novel. These are songs which many of them know the words to and they almost expect to hear. You might, just because Frank Sinatra made the song Fly Me to the Moon famous, if you're going to another sort of classic pop singer, whether a famous one or your local one, and someone in the audience shouts out with vigor, sing Fly Me to the Moon, they're expected to sing it. They're expected to sing it in their way. But again, the surprise comes from the intonation, the vocal arrangement, and the familiarity creates a sense of kinship, a sense of communal atmosphere between the singer and the audience. Very different than something that came to life in the late 60s. And this was the singer songwriter. Because prior to the late 60s, while some singers certainly did their own music, wrote their own lyrics, etc., particularly in the realms of folk and sometimes jazz, in the pop world, it was really you're relying on Tin Pan Alley, you're relying on Broadway, you're relying on something that a jazz composer might have written. And so, what happens when the singer becomes the songwriter? Well, several things in terms of the mentality and in terms of the relationship between the performer and the audience. So, the biggest shift is that we go from audiences expecting to commune over something familiar, a song they've heard 1,000 times by three, four, or even five different singers, maybe more. It shifts from that to I'm Joni Mitchell, I'm James Taylor, I'm fill in the blank. I'm Don McLean. I'm Harry Chapin. I'm Jim Croce. And here I am, Kenny Rankin, one of my favorites. And here I am to give you something novel, something you've never heard before. It's my original song. I wrote it this month. I wrote it 6 months ago. It's on my last album that maybe you haven't bought yet, that maybe didn't make it your way to your local radio station. I'm going to bombard you with this. And it creates something different. Here you are communing over a singer's originality more than his or her voice. And indeed, many of the singers of this generation, the singer-songwriter generation, some had great voices, some had good voices, some, Tom Waits, didn't even have an acceptable voice. But you weren't listening to Tom Waits because his voice had conformed to traditional or objective standards of beauty or even pleasantness. You were listening for his message, for his vibe, for his songwriting. And that would have been something that would have been unheard of in the age of traditional pop singers who were singing songs by Rodgers and Hammerstein, or, people like that. And the audience expected them to be sung with a certain level of what we can call objective perfection. So the singer songwriter revolution really changed the world. Or did it? Well, it certainly did among the young generation. But what's the good thing about being unencumbered as a vocalist? It means that so long as you can hold a note, you can sing anything. And so, beginning in the 70s and going on through the 80s, all of these big, and in some cases beginning in the 60s, these classic traditional singers of the classic pop era started to sing songs composed by these singer songwriters. You saw modern songs from the late 60s into the 70s and 80s, sung by the Sinatras of the world, the Andy Williams of the world, who actually made a conscious decision to start including more and more music that was from the young singer-songwriters of the 60s and 70s. You see it, like I said, in Vic Damone. You see it in all of these singers, Dean Martin even, all of them. And what was interesting is that their format was, right, I'm going to take a song that was sung in, let's say, a more intimate fashion by the songwriter, and I'm going to improve upon it. Now, I'm not saying that in an arrogant way, but I'm saying, look, these people were juggling a lot. They were juggling the composition, the chords, the lyrics, what the song meant to them. That's a lot of things to do at once, and there's some emotional baggage as well. These guys then from the classic pop era came in and said, right, I'm going to sing these songs just as a pure singer with my interpretation. I'm going to belt it out. I'm going to make it about the vocal performance, and yes, the instrumental arranger will make it about that as well, but it's going to be more about the voice than about the overall message. And one of the most famous examples was a comparatively late career hit by Perry Como, who sung the wonderful song, one of the best songs ever, And I Love You So, which was originally written by singer-songwriter Don McLean of American Pie fame. And objectively, Perry Como does belt it out a bit more. If a singing teacher looking at these kind of metrics were comparing the original Don McLean with Perry Como, they would have to conclude Perry Como sung it better. Now, did he sing it more authentically? Well, no one can sing it more authentically than the person who wrote the song. But did they sing it more convincingly? Well, the pop charts, depending on how old you were in the mid 70s, told two different stories. Younger people would have been accessing the original, and older people who, for reasons of social stigma, may not have bought a record with a sort of young guy with long hair, they would have found his music, Don McLean's music, perfectly acceptable if they accessed it through the prism of the more straight-laced, older-fashioned, more visibly conservative Perry Como. And so even in an age where the pop music world became dominated by the rock influence that underpinned the singer-songwriter revolution of the late 60s, even as the sounds of rock, guitars, electric keyboards, drums with a backbeat as opposed to a swing, even as that became the dominant musical language of the pop music world, starting in the 60s and taking it right up through the early 21st century, these older cats were still doing their thing, and they still had an audience that ironically was getting exposed to the music of young people. So, for instance, on this 1985 album, I Just Called to Say I Love You, Vic Damone sings many modern songs. He sings "I Just Called to Say I Love You" that Stevie Wonder did, I think, in 1980. I think 80 or 81. I think 1980. He does "She's Only a Woman," which Billy Joel did in the early 70s. He did "Something" by George Harrison, his Beatles song. And these were songs that a lot of Victor Moan's pre existing audience would have been totally uninterested in. Now, I'm not being dogmatic because there were people who would have bought records by Victor Moan and by the Beatles and by Billy Joel. But in general, if you were, let's say, by 1985, if you were 35 or under, chances are you'd have a Billy Joel record, a Don McLean record, a Beatles record, a Stevie Wonder record. If you were over the age of 40, or especially over the age of 50, you would have had some of Victor Moan's records from when he was young, skipped over the whole rock and roll thing, but now you're getting introduced to the rock and roll generation because Victor Moan is making it acceptable. And he's not doing it as a political or ideological or even transgenerational statement. He's doing it because he's thinking, hell, I'm going to do what I've always done. I'm going to look at the songs that are popular over the last few years or decades. I'm going to look at the songs that I like or that my arranger brings to me as a recommendation, and I'm going to sing them. And how am I going to sing them? I'm going to sing them not by doing a Stevie Wonder impersonation or a George Harrison impersonation or a Billy Joel impersonation. I'm just going to sing them the way I'd sing anything. If Victor Moan or Frank Sinatra were to sing Ba Ba Black Sheep, it would sound like Victor Moan and Frank Sinatra. That's the way that music was at that time. And when Johnny when Johnny Carson, who didn't have much time for rock and roll, he really did his musical taste, as is the case with many people, it sort of stops when you reach a certain age and you get baked into that and you think that everything that comes afterwards is to this or to that or to the other. And again, not everyone feels that way, but lots of people, it's like people become their parents. It used to be, turn off that Beach Boys and Beatles junk. That's nothing. Here, listen to some Bing Crosby. And then the next generation, what's all this Duran Duran and Culture Club nonsense? Listen to some good old Led Zeppelin and Doobie Brothers. And then the next generation, what's all this hair band? Motley Crue, Poison? That's corny. Here, listen to some Nirvana and Pearl Jam. And now you have the sort of 90s generation, whether it's rock or hip hop, all they do in rap today is mumble. Back in my day, Coolio and LL Cool J really knew how to tell a story. And so it's every generation that will have fogies in it who get stuck at a certain time. But what is specifically interesting to this discussion around your traditional pop vocalists is that once they stopped being young and they continue to be good and popular many decades after they were young, the idea of a singer just to be a singer became less and less prominent in the pop music world. And it's not hard to know why. In rock and roll, the singing is an important part of the equation, but it's only one part. The songwriting, the attitude, the lyrics, the level of guitar playing, the level of keyboard playing, of drum playing. And the perfect example of that is look at all the famous rock bands that have changed singers and no one cares. Genesis changed singers and no one cared. If anything, they sold more records with their second singer. Van Halen changed singers. They sold, if anything, a bit more with Sammy Hagar. Journey started with the keyboard player being a singer. Singing was an afterthought to Journey. Then they brought Steve Perry in, and that did make them more popular, but they were still Journey because when Steve Perry left, they continued to tour as Journey and they continued to, make big hits everywhere. And so the singing component became very much reduced. Now, there is one music making demographic that tended to hold on to the singer as everything model much longer than another demographic, and it is racial, black versus white. Rock and roll while yes, its roots and origins and founders were very much steeped in the rhythm and blues traditions, when rock and roll truly became mainstream, the face of it became the white bands, not even the white solo artists, but the bands. And what was going on in the world of black music? Well, you had jazz, which was generally an instrumental first scenario. You had jazz fusion, which combined usually instrumental rock and jazz, but you also had the black vocal solo artist and the black vocal group. Both for both of those categories, again, the singing came first, just as it did for white entertainers of the previous generation, your Sinatras, your Perry Comos, etc. And that's why you see, and I did a video just about this, whether it spans like the Four Tops or the Temptations or later vocal groups from the 70s, like the Stylistics or the Dramatics or the OJs, you see them being able to survive across different musical trends and generational lines. Let's just take the Temptations. They came of age in the age of Motown style soul. They transitioned into sort of late 60s sort of soul rock fusion. They then transitioned into mid 70s funk, late 70s disco, early 80s electro funk, mid 80s sort of very synth and drum machine driven pop. Four Tops followed the same trajectory. Now, why were these vocal groups able to do that? Well, because they put the vocals first, and the vocals are, after all, much more adaptable than anything else. If saxophone based music goes out of style and all you can do is play the saxophone, you're a bit, in a difficult position. Think of anything else. Look at the guitar. The guitar wasn't all that dominant in the pop music of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. From the 60s onwards, it sure was. What about today? Is there much guitar on the records, dating myself here, on the music that you hear today? No, it's been replaced by more synth and sampler and sequencer driven music that is created in a computer digital workstation. And so the guitar, which was once king, is king no more. In terms of being a dominant feature in pop music. With the voice, you have no such problem. You just need to say, right, okay, well, this music's out of style. Get in a disco arranger here. And it's true for solo artists as well. There's the famous story of in the late 70s, Cab Calloway recorded his famous song, Minnie the Moocher, with a disco backing because he thought, well, everyone loves this song, but disco's in. So I'm going to get a disco arranger and some studio musicians capable of creating that disco sound, and I'm going to do a disco version of Minnie the Moocher. Heidi, 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 Heidi. You all know it. And he did a disco version, and it's out there, and I encourage you to listen to it. And it's very interestingly, when he was approached to do the Blues Brothers film, he said, because this was right at the beginning of 1980, he said, I want to sing the disco version. And the Blues Brothers guys who created the film, Aykroyd, John Landis, the director, Belushi, they said, no, we want the original arrangement. And he was quite offended by that. He was quite proud that as a vocalist, he could sing just as well as he ever could. And that's objectively true. He came from that hard-working, hard-singing generation. But he was insulted that they wanted to hear something old-fashioned because he was proud of the fact that while his voice was as good as ever, he was able to sing within the context of the music that was hip at the time, which would have been disco. Because in fact, the Blues Brothers, by reviving blues, older styles of soul, way older styles of R&B, it was a throwback movie. That was part of the joke, that these two white guys were into the mainly black music from generations that were already sort of going out of style. And Cab Calloway, being the oldest guy on the set, was actually, ironically, he encapsulated that interesting and maybe contradictory atmosphere there. And so then the question is, well, why have black singers hung on to that tradition slightly longer? I would argue that it's gone for everyone now. But even after it started to go away for the young generation of white singers, beginning in the 70s, it carried on for a few more generations among black singers. And why is this? I would consider church attendance and the styles of worship that apply across different demographic lines. Because throughout the second half of the 20th century, church attendance among the black population was far higher, at times exponentially higher than the white population. Now, what happens not in all churches, but in many, if not most? Singing happens. And in black churches, the style of singing is much more contemporary than in most white churches. In other words, the space between gospel and what can pass as pop music is very narrow. Why is it? Because rhythm and blues and soul music, as the name soul music would indicate, actually owes a lot stylistically and in terms of arrangement and in terms of training to gospel music. And so, because of that, black people who wanted to enter the music industry had much more of a vocally aware attitude than white people who wanted to enter it, who by the 70s, the average white kid was trying to be the next guitar hero, the next Jimmy Page, the next Robin Trower, later on the next Eddie Van Halen, where the black artists were looking at things and thinking more vocally, not exclusively. Again, lots of nuance. Look at Ernie Isley, for instance, great instrumentalist. Look at all of the Isley brothers who joined after 73, for that matter. But again, and jazz, of course. But this, in terms of pop, was definitely the reality. And now it's all gone, I would argue. Well, yes, black church attendance is still higher in the US and I think throughout North America. In general, not many people are interested in singing for the sake of it. It looks like Johnny Carson's warning in 1985 turned out to be true. Singing now is something that is about ideas, about gimmicks, about vibe, but pure singing because someone has a voice that sounds really good and he or she can do anything with it so long as they've got a microphone in their hand, that is becoming passe. Was temporarily revived for things like American Idol. But if you've noticed, the minute those guys got famous, they adopted all of the gimmicks of people who didn't become famous through a singing contest. That says it all. At least it does for me. But let me know what you think. Leave your comments in the thingy. And as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.